Reports of demonstrations and civil unrest surface as the CCP's lockdowns continue. Omicron reaches Beijing ahead of the Winter Olympics, sparking a new wave of lockdowns. In preparation for the Games, the CCP threatens foreign athletes and targets political dissidents. A Tibetan intellectual is harassed by local police and threatened with imprisonment for posting comments about the Tibetan language on Chinese social media. The French Parliament passes a motion to condemn China for crimes against humanity, becoming the fifth nation to do so. Threatening family members, coercion, and kidnapping. A new report uncovers the methods through which overseas Chinese are forced to return to China to face imprisonment. Welcome to the show. I'm the Inspector, and this is the Nord Report. In last week's episode, I covered the lockdowns taking place in Xi'an and a few other cities in China, where millions of people were not allowed to leave their homes, even for reasons as essential as buying food. Given the severity of that situation, I assumed updates would be plentiful. To my surprise, however, as of last week, that has not been the case. I was only able to find two noteworthy stories, the first of which was published by NTD's China in Focus. In an episode which premiered on January 21st, NTD's Tiffany Meyer reports that a group chat among residents from a neighborhood in Xi'an has listed some reasons why people ought to follow the rules.
Within the message group, a post cites 10 reasons to stay in line. Most of them highlight the consequences of violating stay-at-home orders. Topping the list, the first warning reads, "Your home will be surrounded by police cars and ambulances, and will be sealed." Next, the post warns that pandemic control staff will come for anyone who breaks the rules, and will take him or her away. But worth noting, the post doesn't actually use the term pandemic control staff. Instead, it references masked white robes. The full warning reads, "You will be dragged away by masked white robes like butchers who slaughter pigs." The post also addresses men's best friend. It states that rule breakers' pets will be slaughtered. It goes on to cite official policy wording, describing a treatment to make pets harmless. As for the remainder of the group chat's warning list, one point notes that officials may choose to quarantine apartment buildings, communities, or even entire towns, all if just a single person violates lockdown orders. While the final consequence describes going through quarantine without smartphones or other devices, as officials may decide to confiscate them.
I guess we can summarize that as, do as you're told, or else. Boy, I'm sure glad that governments everywhere decided at the start of this pandemic that China's model was really the way to go. It kind of makes you feel that governments everywhere really have everyone's best interests at heart, doesn't it? Before I get to the second update, I feel like an explanation is in order. As you might be able to tell from my costume, I'm a nerd. I also have a somewhat obsessive personality, which means that whenever I get interested in something, I tend to hyperfocus and fixate on details. Given that China is one of the topics that I've been obsessing over lately, I wanted to find a way to start producing content about it. And the idea behind these Nord reports was that I could filter through the news I consume and aggregate it into, hopefully, weekly compilations that deal with specific topics, which for this series specifically is human rights abuses committed by the CCP. However, as I've started doing so, I've noticed some potential problems which I kind of feel like I need to address. The two problems which I would like to address this week in particular are as follows. I don't speak Mandarin, and I've never been to China. And so these two problems present several challenges when it comes to reporting on China. Now, not living in China obviously prevents me from producing first-hand reports. However, for reasons that will become apparent later in this segment, even if I were living in China, I doubt that I would be able to produce any meaningful first-hand reporting, at least for any extended period of time. The bigger problem, in my mind, is the second-hand reporting. Because I don't speak Mandarin, I can't actively monitor Chinese social media platforms, and more importantly, I can't personally verify that translations provided by whoever I'm reporting on are accurate. In this situation, the best that I can do is vetting the sources that I use, try to find multiple outlets which independently corroborate the same story, and ensure that you, the viewer, are aware that I am by no means an expert. These segments represent my best attempt at trying to put together a puzzle with pieces that are often fuzzy and, in some cases, outright missing. The end result will undoubtedly be colored by my own biases, as in which sources I believe are trustworthy, for example. Now, that being said, because I'm just some guy in a costume with a webcam and a microphone, I imagine that I have more freedom to report on topics where the available information is limited or of a more speculative nature than I imagine I might have if I was working as a journalist in some official capacity. Provided then, of course, that I'm upfront with you when I'm doing so. So, what's my point? As I mentioned previously, updates on this story were rather scarce last week. Aside from the one we've already seen, the other story I'd like to share indicates that protests have started taking place in China in response to the ongoing lockdowns. However, before I share that story, I want to discuss one of the reasons why I believe getting information about current events from China in real time can be difficult. This is the official website for Reporters Without Borders, an international organization of journalists who advocate for freedom of the press. Each year, they release a report called the World Press Freedom Index, where they rank 180 countries according to the level of freedom available to journalists. And the rankings are based on a number of factors like pluralism, media independence, stuff like that. And in 2021, China was ranked as one of the worst countries in the world when it came to freedom of the press, coming in third lowest at 177, which is roughly the same spot they've held for as far back as I care to check. And so, what does it take to consistently rank this low on the World Press Freedom Index? In 2013, a notice known as Document Number 9 was widely circulated within the Chinese Communist Party by party leadership. The notice describes 7 noteworthy problems which threaten party rule and calls on all party members to strengthen their resistance to what is described as infiltration by foreign influences. Point 5 of the document describes one of these foreign influences as the West's idea of journalism, which is labeled as a challenge to the principle that Chinese media should be subject to party discipline. Calls for freedom of the press and the abolition of their propaganda departments are dismissed as venues through which opponents seek to, quote, gouge an opening through which to infiltrate our ideology. In other words, the CCP is explicitly hostile to the very concept of a free and independent press. If you're interested in an exceptionally detailed description of the ways in which this hostility manifests itself, then I recommend the book Hidden Hand. The authors, Clive Hamilton and Marieke Olberg, are both credentialed academics and are highly knowledgeable when it comes to the CCP. So here's one small sample of what they've documented. The CCP's demands for media loyalty are not abstract pleas, but are enforced through an intricate system of control before and after publication or broadcast. Propaganda departments regularly send orders to media in China regarding the topics that must be highlighted and those that must not be covered. Designated political editors closely inspect content for political mistakes. After news items have been aired or printed, they are checked again for deviations from the party line. Any political mistake results in fines and demotions for those deemed responsible. On top of having absolute control over Chinese media, the CCP also restricts where foreigners are allowed to travel within China, which makes it virtually impossible for foreign reporters to document, well, anything that happens most places in the Chinese mainland. And as I discussed in last week's episode, the CCP also censors and persecutes Chinese citizens who post things online that put the party in a bad light. And so, with all of this in mind, I bring to you this week's update on China's ongoing lockdowns.
Talking about all these little incidents that have been going on.
There's actually some protests going on.
Yeah, there's a little protest going
rare.
on. It's rare, but you see the footage leaked. It's not rare.
I was going to say it's rare because it's not reported at all.
Yeah,
There's tons of protests in China. They get shut down and people get arrested and thrown away in jail forever.
Yeah. Here we got a little protest going on in Shenzhen, actually. And
over the extreme lockdowns where people don't get... Again, this isn't even about lockdowns. This is when you spring something on people and they don't know it's coming.
Yeah.
Because you've been told that there's no COVID in China.
And again, all right, somebody who's living in Shenzhen right now will be like, oh, you're talking crap. I didn't see this. It didn't happen. Of course you didn't see it. It's in freaking...
It's not reported.
A little Shaochu in Baoan or Longgang or wherever. You won't see that stuff because you're walking around in Futian and in Luohu and stuff in the CBD, going to the Mixi Mall or to some fancy Coco Park or something. You're not going to see that.
No.
You know, that's the thing.
That's how cut off media is in China.
Yeah, absolutely.
That clip was an excerpt from the most recent episode of ADV Podcasts. The hosts are two YouTubers, Lowy86 and Serpent ZA. I've been following them for a while, and what I've gathered regarding their credentials, let's say, is that they've both lived in China for about a decade. During that time, they got as immersed in the local culture as it's possible to get. They learned the language, they started their own businesses, and I believe they both got married to Chinese women. They both have impressive catalogs of content when it comes to reporting on China, and much of what they produce is rather unique. Their content passes my smell test, and based on that, they are, in my opinion, credible. Introductions aside, here's what happened in China last week, according to them.
So anyway, just to show you, people are not happy, okay?
Well, because they're not getting their food supplies. They've been told that they could leave, and then all of a sudden they lie and they don't let people out, you know? I've had people reach out personally.
Sure, me too. Like I said, I've had people send me videos of themselves stuck in their apartments.
And this is in places that are not even claimed to be in lockdown.
Correct. It's ridiculous. Anyway, it's and of course we can't show you that because we'd be putting their lives in danger. You have to understand.
Yeah.
For those of you wondering, like, where's the footage? That would be really stupid.
You can't show personal.
For me to show my friends who are currently locked down
Yes.
in Shenzhen, because that would just put a big target on their back.
Yes.
Okay, so that's a little thing going on in Shenzhen, and we've got something else that happened in Xi'an coming up here. I believe that's okay. Now, what's going on here is in Xi'an. Okay, we talked about Xi'an in our previous podcast. Serious lockdowns there. People actually running out of food.
Yeah, because that's in central China.
Yeah, in central China. We were talking about the whole thing about buying fresh, and so most people do not have a lot of refrigerated goods, long life goods in their house, and they depend on going out to get food. So a lot of people have been caught unawares. Okay, because these lockdowns are quick and sudden. It's not like you get a warning
Because of media blackout.
Yeah.
They're not like, coming soon. They're like, no, you're fine.
Yeah, exactly, Doug. Now you
can't leave
go out.
now.
So the government has, of course, made big strides and attempts to put on this propaganda that they're feeding everyone. But the problem is that, yes, people have been getting food now from the government, okay? But only people with local hukou. And a hukou, as we've spoken about before, is kind of like a domestic passport. It dictates where you're from, so where you have your rights. So migrant workers, which are a huge portion of the population in any big city in China, have not been getting food. So here you've got one of these migrant workers up here and a lot of other migrant workers shouting, "Where is our food?" You have to understand how frustrating that must be, because your own government doesn't acknowledge that you are worthy of receiving a food package simply because you came from out of town to work in a city, and now the city's on lockdown. You're in there, you're not allowed to leave, but they're not going to give you food because you're not a local. Isn't that just ridiculous?
Before I end this segment, I'd like to add a note on why I felt the need to create such an elaborate disclaimer prior to introducing ADV podcasts as a source, without doing the same for NTD, for example. There are a few different reasons why, but the most relevant one, I believe, can be found in another quote from Hidden Hand. As a result of concerted efforts by Beijing, nearly all Chinese language media in Western countries are now directly or effectively under the CCP's control, with only a few noteworthy exceptions such as Mingjing News, the Falun Gong-linked Epoch Times, and New Tang Dynasty TV. In other words, these channels represent some of the only Chinese language media in the world which is not directly controlled by the CCP. NTD News is owned by New Tang Dynasty TV, and given that they operate as an official news broadcaster, I feel like they don't require as much setup to be taken as seriously as an independent podcast run by a couple of YouTubers might. And being the nerd that I am, I felt almost a compulsion to add that explanation in, so there's that. The CCP virus sat on a wall. The CCP virus had a great fall. All the CCP's forces and all the CCP's men simply can't contain the spread of Omicron. Despite all of their worst efforts, the latest iteration of the CCP virus has officially reached Beijing. The Epoch Times reports that on January 17th, the Beijing Olympic organizers stopped selling tickets to the general public after the city reported its first case of the virus. I guess there is some truth to the adage that what goes around comes around. Sweet, sweet irony. Instead of seeing the humor in the situation and changing their dastardly ways, the CCP has, unfortunately, decided to double down on their abusive tendencies. As indicated by the previous segment, this doubling down is impacting a wide spectrum of people. In this segment, however, there are 3 groups in particular that I would like to draw attention to: Chinese citizens living in and around Beijing, Olympic athletes, and human rights advocates in China. Starting with the first group, let's take a look at how the CCP's crackdowns are affecting Chinese citizens in and around Beijing. The first person in Beijing who tested positive for Omicron was reportedly a 26-year-old banker. Beijing officials publicized details of her whereabouts over the past month and ordered anyone who might have crossed paths with her during that time to immediately report to officials and threatened to punish anyone who failed to do so. The reason why officials had this information available is, of course, because the party is basically always spying on everybody in China at all times. Those efforts, however, seem to have been in vain, because as of January 23rd, Beijing officials introduced a number of additional measures, which includes preventing unvaccinated preschoolers from attending kindergarten, despite those vaccinations being allegedly voluntary. What's more, several million people in China's Henan province are now confined to their homes. Moving on to the second group, in preparation for the upcoming Olympic Games, the CCP has started issuing threats against the attending athletes. On January 18th, the Deputy Director General of International Relations for the Beijing Organizing Committee announced the following during a press conference. Any expression that is in line with the Olympic spirit, I'm sure will be protected. Any behavior or speech that is against the Olympic spirit, especially against the Chinese laws and regulations, are also subject to certain punishment. That threat prompted human rights advocacy groups to warn athletes against speaking out against the CCP's abuses while in China. These warnings come in light of the fact that the CCP has been known to kidnap and detain foreign nationals in the past, and so I think we can safely assume that there is a real possibility of something similar happening to athletes who don't take these warnings seriously. The third group, which seems to be receiving special attention from the CCP as they prepare for the Olympic Games, are human rights advocates living in China. Several reports surfaced last week which indicate that the rate at which the CCP is silencing dissenting voices has increased. This makes sense if you consider the fact that China is about to become the first country in history to consecutively host both the Summer and Winter Olympics. That represents a great source of propaganda that could be used by the CCP to project an image of strength and legitimacy, both domestically and internationally. It would be a shame if some selfish malcontents were to ruin that opportunity, and so maybe it's better to get rid of that potential hiccup beforehand. Speaking of the suppression of human rights advocates, there is one report in particular that I feel deserves special attention. On January 20th, Bitter Winter, which is a magazine that focuses on religious liberty and human rights, published the following story. Tashi Wangchuk is a Tibetan intellectual who received international attention in 2015 after his story was published by the New York Times. The article described his difficulties in finding a place where his 2 teenage nieces could study Tibetan. At the time, Chinese authorities were making this task rather difficult. An increasing number of schools began limiting the teaching of Tibetan, and some of them eliminated it outright. As a result, some parents started sending their children to private courses teaching the language in monasteries, but even those efforts were thwarted when the monasteries were forbidden from instructing anyone who is not a practicing monk. This suppression was causing people like Mr. Tashi to worry that the Tibetan cultural heritage was slowly being snuffed out, and so he decided to petition the government to allow local schools to teach Tibetan children their mother tongue. Bitter Winter describes what happened next. He was arrested in 2016 and received a 5-year prison sentence on charges of separatism. Following his release in 2021, Tashi discovered the situation in Tibet had gotten worse, and so once again he decided to petition the government. This resulted in a visit from police on January 17, 2022, where he was again threatened with arrest for posting comments about the Tibetan language on Chinese social media, which the police said was illegal. The reason why I wanted to highlight this story in particular is because it's emblematic of the methods regularly employed by the CCP to suppress minorities. If trends like these are allowed to continue, then I fear it's only a matter of time before unique cultures like that of Tibet become little more than historical footnotes. And given enough time, perhaps even those footnotes will eventually be lost forever. On the 20th of January, France became the 5th country to officially recognize the CCP's treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang as genocide. France's parliament has now officially joined the US, the UK, the Netherlands, and Canada in condemning China for crimes against humanity and genocide. The motion passed the French parliament with 169 votes for and 1 vote against. Ironically, the motion was led by France's Socialist Party, which I guess goes to show that even a broken clock can be right twice a day. I found the timing of this motion somewhat amusing because it came on the heels of a controversy sparked by one Chamath Palihapitiya, who is one of the owners of an American basketball team called the Golden State Warriors. On January 15th, Chamath participated in a podcast called All In, where he declared the following.
Interesting.
Nobody cares
to run
about.
again? Is
No,
this
let's be honest, nobody cares about what's happening to the Uyghurs. Okay, you bring it up because you really
What?
care, and I think
What do
that's
you mean
nice that
nobody
you
cares?
care. The rest of us don't care. I'm just
Well,
telling
really
you a
don't care?
very hard.
Wait,
I'm
you're
telling
saying
you
you
a very.
personally don't care?
I'm telling you a very hard, ugly truth. Okay, of all the things that I care about, yes, it is below my line. Okay,
Oh,
of all the things that I
that's
care about, it is below my line.
disappointing.
By January 17th, that clip had gone viral, and articles detailing the backlash started appearing. The backlash revealed that Chamath is officially, in my opinion, a little bitch, as the billionaire groveled and tried to deflect the outrage by appealing to his status as a refugee. Personally, I don't believe that he is genuinely sorry. I think he's sorry that he got caught, so to speak. Sorry that he let the mask slip. The reason I think so is because his original statement is perfectly in line with actions previously taken by the NBA as an organization. For those of you who don't know, back in 2019, the general manager of the Houston Rockets, which is another basketball team, published a tweet in support for the Hong Kong protests, which were taking place at the time. This prompted the NBA's chief communication officer to issue an official statement where he apologized for the inappropriate remarks, which supposedly seriously hurt the feelings of Chinese sports fans. The reason for this pathetic groveling was because the general manager could probably sense what was coming at the time, namely that China temporarily halted a streaming deal worth $1.5 billion in response to the original tweet. Separately from this, in 2020, an investigation revealed that the NBA had been running a basketball academy in Xinjiang, although this arrangement was terminated shortly after coming to light. Given the NBA's financial interests in China and the punishments they have received when individuals associated with the organization have spoken out against human rights abuses in the past, I speculate that Mr. Billionaire Refugee's original remarks might have been made to secure his own financial interests. I guess it's hard to care about genocide when you're being paid not to. I'm glad to see that the French are more based than he is, which honestly is a line I'd never thought I'd say. Family members of a Chinese national living abroad are visited by their local police at home. Soon thereafter, the relative abruptly returns to China, praises the party, and goes on trial. Chinese police enter another country on tourist visas and visit a Chinese national living there, who then magically reappears back in China, with state media reporting him having returned to face justice. A Chinese national living abroad disappears. Rumors say they've been drugged and kidnapped. Later, they reappear back in China, but no immigration record of them leaving exists. Trials follow. These are 3 examples of what a new report calls involuntary returns, which is defined as the use of non-traditional, often illegal, means of forcing someone to return to China against their will, most often to face certain imprisonment. The report was published on January 18th by Safeguard Defenders, which is an NGO dedicated to combating human rights abuses in Asia, and what they've been able to document is truly shocking. According to the report, since 2014, the CCP has captured nearly 10,000 fugitives from more than 120 countries. These so-called fugitives include former officials accused of corruption, political dissidents, religious minorities, activists, and even asylum seekers. The vast majority of these cases were handled in one of 3 ways, referred to as Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3. Type 1 returns involve threatening the target's family members who still live in China in order to convince them to return to China and face trial. For Type 2 returns, Chinese police, agents, and even other state and non-state actors are sent to the target's host country to force the target to return through promises and threats. Type 3 returns are the most extreme. In these cases, the target is outright kidnapped and smuggled back to China. I've often heard it said that the CCP functions more like a criminal cartel than a legitimate government, and this report certainly reinforces that notion. These are the methods that they use to target people who don't live inside of China anymore. And I mean, most of them are Chinese citizens, but What the CCP considers a Chinese citizen it's a really broad category. Basically, if you have any ties to China whatsoever, like your parents emigrated from there, moved to another country, and you were born in that country, the CCP still considers you a Chinese national. And as such, they believe that such individuals fall under their jurisdiction. And these are some of the kinds of people that they've been targeting through these methods. People who speak out against them, people who criticize them online. And those are definitely actions that are more in line with a criminal organization than a legitimate government. As a Freedom House report from 2021 puts it, China conducts the most sophisticated, global, and comprehensive campaign of transnational repression in the world. And while the international targets of the CCP's extrajudicial extraditions have primarily been members of the Chinese diaspora, I believe it's conceivable that at some point in the future, they're going to start targeting dissenters who don't have any ties to China, provided they are able to amass enough international power and influence. It's up to people like you and me to ensure that we never get to that point. And with that, we've reached the end of this week's episode. Thanks for watching, and be sure to tune in again next week for more updates. Until then, stay informed and stay free.